So Luke Caspar Pearson is a London-based designer and lecturer in architecture at the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, where he's director of their undergraduate architecture program. One of the areas where there's so much kind of like movement in 3D kind of game engines. He's the co-founder of the design research practice You+Pea with Sandra Youkhana, whose works operate at the intersection of architecture and game design. Luke has been in the relationship between architecture and game spaces on publications such as Eflux Architecture, Volume, Frame, Thresholds, and the Journal of Architectural Education. So please take it away, Luke.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks very much for such an interesting event, and it was a topic that seemed incredibly kind of pertinent. So hopefully you can see me scrolling through the site, which is going to have all the images on, and a video at the end, which hopefully won't crash. As I said, this is the work that we do in our Videogame Urbanism studio, which I teach with Sandra Youkhana at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London. So we work with students who are from an architectural background, and we're working pretty much entirely in game engines for 1 calendar year with them to make games about urbanism, about cities, about architecture. And hopefully, as I'll kind of talk about, I think the way that we approach that is quite broad, but also maybe I think challenges some of the preconceptions that maybe even the game engine makers might have about what the future of their software is in relation to architecture. Outside the games industry, obviously one of the most enthusiastic adopters of game engines has been the architecture and construction industries. And so in response to that, the leading, the big two, Unity and Unreal, have both developed their own specific software that's designed for those industries. So Unity, I think it's still sort of, I'm not sure if it's completely complete or if it's still in a sort of beta stage at the moment, but I think since late 2019, Unity's been pushing out this bit of software called Unity Reflect, which promises to be able to plug into BIM software, which is building information modeling software, which is these kind of holistic design environments that architects are now using, which enables them to produce drawings, to produce packages of information for construction and things like that. So it's clear that they see the future as kind of plugging into these types of things. Unreal, I think, are kind of doing it within their whole engine. So you've integrated it as one product, and it seems like the kind of architectural visualization side of things is not necessarily seen as a separate endeavor to the game engine proper in a way. And if you go on their website, you'll see that they've got a list of collaborators, which is like a who's who of large-scale commercial architects. So ACOM, Foster and Partners, Gensler, HOK, Zaha Hadid. So I think as you can kind of see here, there's already a way that they're very sort of tightly integrated with architecture, but I suppose what I thought was interesting in relation to the themes of this conference was they're tied into a very particular sort of architect and a very particular way of looking at the built environment. So if you go and watch all of the videos, and they look very very well produced, but they show their architectural game engines being used in one of two ways generally, which is either to visualize glossy penthouse apartments with marble floors, fluffy pillows, and unusually shaped chandelier lighting, or they're used to show how efficient they're going to make architects. So you have systems breakdowns, x-rays through buildings, architects look with their hard hat on, pointing at things with something up on their iPad. So they very much sort of framed themselves as in a quite a typical way as design software that either enables the visualization of something very seductive or a kind of hyper efficiency in relation to design. And so by doing this, the game engines brought themselves into contact with other game engine-like products, which aren't necessarily used for making games, but are still real-time rendering environments, like Lumion and Enscape. And so I think it's interesting because it's probably fair to say that these game engines are revolutionizing architectural visualization, for instance. Having spoke with people that run visualization companies before, they're now increasingly targeting graduates from game design courses because they have these skills in real-time rendering packages. And so there's a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of the way that architecture is visualized in particular, which is kind of taken place in relation to these game engines. But I think what for me and for Sandra and I is kind of interesting and challenging is that this does also suggest at the moment that the game engine's role in architecture might be destined to become a vehicle for powerful developers to gaze upon their investments, or a novel way for real estate agents to market penthouse apartments. And Unreal, if you read some of their blurb, it kind of would tally with that, because they say that the engine's great for going from immersive VR and AR to glossy brochures and marketing videos. So it's clear they're tapped into a very specific reading of what architecture could be. Now, this is quite a superficial test, but if you type in Unreal Archviz into Google, you get this kind of aesthetic that permeates through everything. And so it seems slightly ironic that game engines, if they're able to synthesize many different possible worlds, that all of these worlds sort of tend to look the same. And it kind of reminds me of Kyle Chaker's writing on the idea of airspace and the permeation of Airbnb aesthetics around the world, and whether that's also something that might be the future of game engines if we're not necessarily careful about it. And it also seems to reinforce some of the existing power structures or some of the definitions of what luxury and desirability might be in architecture. So I think what we would kind of encourage, and what we do in our educational practice and in our design research as well, is to look at game engines in relation to architecture in relation to games themselves. So rather than repackaging the game engine as something that's a sort of conservative architectural tool, to think about what it is about game spaces that people find desirable, what's in their kind of nature as architectural spaces, and what are their properties. And so I suppose just as many of the most interesting games come from smaller studios, we might need to look at architects that are not these huge global corporations to find some alternative directions for the game engine in architecture. So one of these might be Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi, who expanded the territory of what tastes architecture could accommodate. For them, the garish, the lowbrow, the vulgar, or the cute, all of which might be used to describe video games, were subjects of concern that architects should address. And so like their pioneering analysis of Las Vegas showed how popular tastes could inform new methodologies of architectural design. And then in London in particular, but in lots of places around the world, there's been a growth in collective and participatory practice of architects working with communities. And obviously it seems that game engines are kind of ideally positioned for that, but you find less messaging about that on the websites when they're actually selling these products. So this is Ekim Tan, and she has these Play the City studio, which does these kind of physical games with stakeholders in the built environment. You could say that in a way the game that's sort of come closest to transcending itself as a game and becoming a piece of design software is obviously Minecraft, and it ironically echoes the kind of the way that architecture was built before the Renaissance period, when it became common to then make drawings of a building before it was built. So before that, the architect would kind of stand on the site and direct the building alongside the craftspeople. And so in a sense, Minecraft as a piece of design software sort of could return us to that type of way of approaching the building of things. In our studio, this is a game that we're working on for a gallery in Germany at the moment, and it's called the London Developers Toolkit. It's kind of a satirical take on this sort of luxury housing market. So in the game, you play as an architect, but an architect who has to kind of undergo a series of sort of slightly mundane activities for a developer, like it uses gesture recognition to detect whether you can do a sufficiently inspirational napkin sketch, whether you can work out what parameters the building will need, and various other tasks, and in the end it gives you a kind of crack Photoshop where you can make your own depictions of your building and communicate them on social media. Maybe the social as well. Architecture has a long history of speculative spaces that weren't necessarily designed to be built, but were designed to maybe say something about reality through the speculation, through the concept. So there's obviously Piranesi's prisons, which were sort of geometrically impossible, and the Capriccio paintings, which were architectural fantasies that brought together buildings and spaces from different time periods together. The 1960s and 70s were particularly kind of important time for this type of work. This is the Generator project by the British architect Cedric Price and John Fraser, where the building was this building, which is a project designed for Gilman Paper Company, would have an AI within it, but rather than the contemporary idea of a building that has a sort of AI that's solemnly running all of the services of the building, it was, in this case, the AI could become bored, it could be playful, it could kind of integrate itself with users in unexpected ways. And then in our school at the Bartlett, we also come from the lineage of Peter Cook and Archigram, where projects like Plug-in City kind of imagines pop culture and technology integrating together into new forms of architecture that were quite unexpected. So for us, if we start to look back at the motives of some of these projects, we might find some new possibilities for what game engines might be in relation to architecture. When we work with our students, they will all end up producing playable games about architecture, and they'll also use screenshots to create drawings. So we kind of tap into the history of architectural representation, but using sometimes hundreds of different screenshots from our game world in order to make one drawing. So use the games as a way of tackling sites, so being very site specific about things. So last year we looked at Tokyo, 3 games from our students, one of which Plug-in Tokyo, which takes you through, it's kind of, the game runs the course through history of different sites. So in this case is looking at Shinjuku in Tokyo's kind of move from farmlands to a place that had a massive water treatment facility through to the modern kind of metropolis heart that it is today, and the players can kind of create these anachronistic structures that might slip in and out of history. And Kalmoji City was a game looking at Kalmoji, the sort of visual language of communication, and it's a kind of conversation between 2 players on 2 keyboards, and as they type in, they create these urban blocks which will start to populate Tokyo Bay. And then Kintsugi City is...
You're getting close to going over on time. You may want to wrap up. Sorry, I've sent you some messages and you may not have seen them, so I thought I'd let you know.
See the screen. Okay.
Yep.
So I'll just, if you can see the video, I'll just let that run and come back here. So this is a kind of video of many of the different projects that we do and the different sort of thematics that they work under.
Great. You have a question. Would you like to go ahead and take it? In your experience of working with architects, have you found that UX and UI of these engines is sufficient for their design sensibilities, or do they require retooling?
I think it depends what kind of software you work in predominantly. I mean, we come from a background of using Rhino, where and the same might go for AutoCAD, where you're quite used to typing lots of things in. So it's not necessarily the kind of command systems are not necessarily completely different. I mean, I think when you start working with students is the kind of snapping of things, and obviously snapping one plane to another, or one geometry to another, is quite crucial in architecture. And then as soon as you get into the world of designing a scene in Unity and you can be a bit more fluid, it's kind of unsettling as an architect, but get used to it, I suppose.
And an interesting comment that was made was someone who said sometimes when they're sitting in a cafe or a bar in LA, it feels like they're sitting inside an engine because it's so, like, it looks so similar to a 3D environment.
I mean, we've done quite a lot of research into Los Santos, And for us, what's fascinating as architects is the fact that the game designers, they realise that to recreate that city, you don't need to recreate its exact geography, but it's about the feeling as much as it is about the actual kind of the geometrical extents of it. And I think that poses, again, sort of interesting questions for us as architects, is like, how much do you need to show for something to feel correct or to have that sense of place?
By the time your students enter the workforce, which things they've learned still kind of carry currency. And as the game engines are sort of through your industry, how do you guys kind of balance that out in predicting, well, what sort of should we be teaching relative to whether or not they might exist kind of 5 years from now?
I think we kind of, it's always touched around the design project. So in a sense, I think you can see most of the games aren't realistic in their kind of graphics. So the cuteness that we think can be a bit of an agency for the work, but in a sense that we're more concerned about how they utilize the game engine in relation to the specific project they're working on. So if it looks kind of janky or out of date, I don't think it necessarily matters, as long as the kind of conceptual driver of the project that they're working on has that kind of that clarity. Yeah, it's interesting because as you say, it's always updating, but in a way we think there's something interesting about also running counter to that constant progression as well, and maybe slowing things down a little bit, because otherwise you just end up chasing the next thing, and that has its own results, which aren't always completely positive as well, I suppose.
Yeah, it was a great presentation. Thanks heaps.